Hello everyone, this is Dr. Subrasinghe with the second lecture on endangered species. In this lecture, I'm going to cover an example of an endangered species, and this is going to help you to develop your own student presentations. And also the content of this lecture will be largely comprise some of your exam questions. At the same time, the structure I am adopting is going to kind of create some guidance for you to make your own presentations. So, before I forget, I'm going to talk about African elephants, right? And we will go over their biology, the threats they encounter, and what kind of conservation activities we already have in place to protect African elephants. Um, First, let me talk about some basic biology, right? So, what is the closest living relative of the African elephant? Well, what type of elephants do we have in North America? Well, let me take my pointer over here. Now, before I go ahead, this presentation, since it's part of the class contents, it's longer than the presentations that you are supposed to do. So the structure, the layout will be the same that we expect from you in your presentation, but the contents will be much smaller because we expect you to finish your presentation within 15 minutes. Now, last thing about your presentations, please do go ahead and read the guidelines I have provided on Blackboard before you start working on your presentation. Just don't simply listen to my presentation and try to structure yours, right? Do that and then read the guidelines. Okay, now finally to my presentation back. There are actually 2 to 3 species depending on how you argue that, right? So the genus is Loxodonta, right? And there are at least 2 very well recognized species, right? Elephas maximus, the Asian elephant that occurs in the Asian continent, and the African elephant, right? That is Loxodonta, Loxodonta africana. Now, there are some. There's a debate whether those are actually how many species of African elephants are there. In certain literature, you find 2 of them. In certain literature, you only refer to Loxodonta africana, and then you might hear about other subspecies, which we will cover later on. And yes, there are different subspecies. And their closest terrestrial living relative is actually these guys. That's actually rock hyraxes, right? And if you look over here, you are looking at their closest living terrestrial relative, right? Now, speaking about other relatives of of elephants, right? Well, of course, the closest living relative of African elephant is the Asian elephant, but closest living relative of all elephants, there are 2. The closest aquatic species is the sirens, is in the family Sirenia, manatees, and manatees relatives are closely related species, but they're aquatic, and then the rock hyraxes are actually the closest terrestrial species. There are lots of extinct species, right? Mammoths, Mastodon, right? There are several genera of extinct species, and some of the extinctions, like in the mammoth, is fairly recent. It happened during, after the Pleistocene glaciation, right? So, their current range, well, African elephants, where else do you find them? Africa, right? And in this map, you are looking at 2 type of ranges, right? You know, the bright orange coloration that indicates the current known ranges of the African elephant, or ranges that are actually very likely to occur that you don't have direct evidence. Maybe you have indirect evidence like dung, but you don't have direct observations. So those red/orange range areas, those localities are of high confidence for occurrence of African elephants. The yellow ones are actually areas where they may have occurred possibly historically, but there is no known direct or indirect records. And then the countries labeled with the labels: Tanzania, Malawi, Kenya, Uganda, and Togo. Those are the countries where you have very serious concerns of ivory trade that severely endangers the African elephant populations. Well, that is actually the manatees that are of the order Sirenia, that is a closest aquatic living relative of the elephants. Um, and well, this is actually kind of a map showing you where you find the members of Sirenia, right? And it's kind of interesting, yeah, that distribution is largely not restricted to, but more predominantly occurs in the southern hemisphere. And there is the only known or the recent population of Sirenias, that is actually the Steller sea calves. They have actually gone extinct. They are the only currently known northern hemispherical location, and most of the other ones are actually largely limited to the southern hemisphere, right? And of course, some of those, certain parts, like as you see in this part, these are actually kind of at the border of the northern and the southern hemisphere. The same thing around here, right? But largely these Sirenians are actually occurring in the southern part of the world. Well, that's actually the Steller sea cow. Okay, let's move on. So, what are other biologically important? What are the other important biological features that I want you to know about African elephants? They actually behave in herds, right? It's called a matriarchal herd, right? And when you see that word, matriarchal herd, you know what that means. Those are female only herds that are dominated by older females, right? The lead member, the dominant female of the matriarchal herd, is the oldest female in that particular group. And then there is a, like funky term, boys club, that is actually the equivalent of the male organization. Now, matriarchal herds are actually relatively permanent, right? They're actually very strictly, the membership is permanent, right? And largely comprises of females. A few juvenile males could be a member of a matriarchal herd, but those juvenile males are not permanent members, right? They actually leave the herd after a certain age, right? But boys clubs or the male herds are not permanent, right? They're actually very transient. They're very temporary. They could actually, the membership is not permanent. They could actually aggregate and then re-segregate into other groups, and certain members of the boys club could actually become solitary elephants for the rest of their life, particularly extremely aggressive ones. So yes, there are those two types of grouping, and those are the boys clubs do not have any female members, right? No juvenile members. And in a matriarchal herd, all the members, right, of that particular group are actually related. They could be sisters, right? Daughters and moms. Daughters and the kind of the if you are a female, right, and you could actually have daughters of your sisters in that particular group as well. So there is a biological kinship, right? A close kinship in the matriarchal herds. In boys clubs, that's not the case. Could you find related individuals in a boys club? Yeah, sure you could, but that's by chance, right? In generally, the boys clubs, the male herds do not have any cohesive feature. So this lack of kinship is another reason probably why the boys clubs in elephants, in African elephants, are rather transitionary, right? Why they are not permanent. And how many members would you expect to be in a single matriarchal herd? Highly variable, as few as 3 individuals, as to many as 25, right? Individuals. So the numbers are quite variable, and there are instances where the number even increased above 25. And as you can see in this particular top image, right, right? This is actually an example of their herd behavior, right? They do actually behave in this particular manner. The leading female, I said it's the oldest, and chances are it's also the largest that actually hang around. Apologizes for that. And it's actually it is old it is the oldest and the largest female that is leading the group, and quite literally when they are moving from one location to another, it is usually led by the female, right? And since she's older, she's more experienced about threats. She's more familiar with the landscape. She's more experienced with survival. So it kind of makes sense why she's taking the lead. And it's also not surprising that some of the tailing end females could also be kind of the next generation of sisters, right? So now in terms of males, I'm not going to even hazard a guess about the number of members. It's quite variable. And it's hard to put a number because the group membership or the group cohesion is so weak. It's very loose aggregations. So even within the same season, the number of members in a male club, a boys club, could vary quite very. It could be highly variable. Um, and why? What is the advantage of living in groups? Why would you observe, particularly females showing this group behavior? Well, that actually strengthens the survival of each member of that particular group rather than by on their own, right? So that's generally that applies to many species that perform group behavior. In fact, when the group behavior is driven by kinship, that per individual survival is extremely high. Right, like I mentioned earlier, when there is a highly experienced female providing the protection, leadership for the particular herd, that actually helps, enhances the survival of the rest of the individuals. Another reason is actually having to do with reproduction. When one member of the particular herd sires a young, all the females actually start milking. And all the females will actually start taking care of the young, right? By feeding it, looking after it, protecting it, you name it. So that kind of group behavior collectively increases the survival of the individuals, right? And in fact, if you wonder what is the reason, the evolutionary reason behind the fact that when a single female sires an offspring, why others lactate, it is regulated by actually pheromones slash hormones, right? So why it is happening? Well, again, because if there's a kinship, right? Even if you are not looking after your own offspring, you are looking after offsprings that are sired to your sister. So there is a strong kinship between the baby and you. So investing in that baby elephant is actually also ensures some of your genes being transmitted to the next generation. So this kinship driven group selection is extremely important in terms of evolutionary sense. And there are some evidences where regrouping happens when you have a large membership and then for some reason they dissociate. And then again they come back into one larger group. That is observed more on the side of the females where you have a very loose group aggregations. So regrouping is largely observed among males. There's a hierarchy. Needless to mention, I did keep mentioning repeatedly that there is a dominant single mature older large female, right? And also and then there's a next tier, right? There's a pecking order, right? Those are the next level of sisters, and then the other another younger generation. Like that, the younger you are, more subordinate you become. The older you are, more dominant you become, right? And this kind of hierarchy is not just limited to within the herd, but there are similar hierarchies between herds, right? Certain herds could be comprised of more dominant individuals, right? More senior, older females, or a larger number of older females, right? That kind of a herd assumes the dominance as a herd within that particular forested landscape, that landscape they occupy. So what is the importance of that? Between herds, that's really important because the dominant, herds monopolizes resources, right? They actually have access to the best resources, the richest grounds for foraging, richest grounds for accessing water. Um, and water is a scarce resource in the African landscape. So, um, and then the within the herd, it's actually enables to establish socialization, the social organization, the social system, right, that supports protection of the young, protection of the weakest, right, and increasing the parental care provision for um, juveniles, right. So that's actually, so how hierarchy works and how it operates within herds and between herds are kind of different. Within a herd, it actually strengthens um, their fitness, right, because of the hierarchy, because of the social organization, but kind of creates a competition when it comes to among different herds. Well, yeah, I did mention that the taking care of the young is a very interesting phenomenon, and in fact, when how many baby elephants do you think that are born to a single herd at a time? Well, most often one. That's because when one female, right, is impregnated, right, when it conceives, when a single female conceives, um, conception stops in other females, right? It kind of ensures that there are a lot more eyes, a lot more individuals to take care of a single young, right? And also, a single female will only sire one offspring at a time, and those little kids take forever to grow, right? In fact, um, there's more stronger hierarchy in the system, right? Even the dominant female or dominant females in certain cases can actually determine which reproductively active female gets to mate, right? It's not like it's not a random one. Or of course, mating is not random in the animal kingdom, period. But it's not actually that particular female's volition, right? She might be biologically fit to reproduce, but it's actually not her decision, right? Whether it's her turn to make love, right? She has to wait until she gets the permission from her oldest sister to do it, right? Again, it ensures that the fitness is preserved within that particular herd, right? It's kind of extremely interesting. And how this actually happens is partly behavioral and of course partly endocrinal, right? Or chemical regulated. And this is also interesting. Usually you know about endocrinal regulation very well. Endocrinal or hormonal regulation largely happens within a particular individual animal, but in this case it actually transmits among different individuals of a given herd. um, so I did mention the socially regulated ovulation, which actually prevents multiple females ovulating at the same time, right? And the reproductive success as well. Because of that, only one female will actually sire an offspring in a given time. And in fact, until a young develops to a particular age, there wouldn't be a round two of birth happening. Right now, let's talk about males. Well, there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about female elephants because of that unique behavior and the herds. There's a few cool things to talk about males as well, right? I think I should have some image somewhere. I might have to go back to that later on. I think it's in a different slide. So, musting, right? So, musting is actually a particular phenomena you observe in male individuals that are ready to reproduce, right? In this situation, there is, they exudate, um, fluids from every orifice in their body, and I will show you an image later on, right? Now, that musting elephants are extremely aggressive, right? They're trying their best to get laid. They're extremely aggressive towards other rival males. So generally, masking the chemical that are exudated, that are excreted by a particular reproductively active male can be sensed by others, right? And kind of the signal you get is, if you see a muscling elephant, just don't mess with it. Like tells you don't fuck with me. I'm pissed, right? I need to get laid. That's the only thing I'm worried about. Don't fuck with me. That's what a muscling elephant is telling you. Um, There's a very long generation time when it comes to elephant. Quite prolonged gestation period. Elephants also live quite long, right? And in fact, there are actually evidence suggesting that sometimes elephant live so long that they lose the function of their teeth before they reach their maximum age, right? So, which is actually kind of a sad news, because elephants could lose all their teeth and still be alive, and they cannot forage, they cannot feed themselves, so they actually starve to death even though there's enough food in the environment. It's kind of extremely sad to think about it. So the generation time is, like I said, is pretty long. It could be as on average, it's about 25 to 30 years. Oh, by the way, what is mean by generation time? Generation time is the time it takes for a particular female, a newborn female, to become reproductively active, right? Well, not just reproductively active. Generation time is a time gap between a female reproducing young and that particular offspring, a female offspring, to sire another female offspring. Now that gap from female reproductively active female to another reproductive active female that can sire offsprings, that time gap is actually the generation time, right? It's about like 25 to 30 years in elephants, right? And for both African and Asian elephants, it's pretty long, right? And then the gestation period could actually last more than a year, right? And then longevity, they usually live around 60 to 70 years. In fact, African elephants living slightly longer than Asian elephants. They do communicate, right? And they communicate by many means, right? And you can see in these images, right, over here, right, this is kind of a communication strategy. They are creating a visual communication by raising their trunk up. That's kind of is considered the salute, right? And also they can actually hear very well. They actually do hear through their feet, right? There are special mechanoreceptory cells located in their feet that enables them to capture vibrations coming along the ground. It's remarkable. And they can also smell. I earlier mentioned about the must, right? And they can also sense that chemicals suspended in the air. So they communicate by multiple different means. So there are, in terms of hearing, I do need to emphasize a little bit more on that. They do hear through airborne vibrations, right? They do have this large ears, right? So they can detect vibration coming through air, but better than that is actually they can sense vibrations coming through ground, through solid substrate, right? And that kind of vibration coming through the ground is collected by their limbs, right? And propagates through their skeletal system into the central nervous system, where that particular vibration can be interpreted, right? So in elephant's feet, the foot pad has these cells, specific sensory cells that are somatosensory cells. Somato means what? Like somatic means like skin, or rather like outside cells, and sensory is actually sensitive to something, right? So this kind of somatosensory cells, is actually considered, it has a special name, Pacini corpuscles. Now you do also have Pacini corpuscles, but they are not as sensitive to vibration as those of elephants, right? They're able to detect the vibrations that is happening on the ground, right? And this kind of communication where they detect vibrations coming off the ground is called seismic communication. There's a lot of interesting literature out there if you want to read about that. So this is actually quite interesting, right? There's a lot of interesting studies going on in trying to understand how elephants detect and interpret seismic signals for many different reasons, right? Because if you can interpret seismic signals, like which elephants do, right, in extremely successfully, if you can recreate that sensory system through technology, you can actually understand how understand and detect any geochemical activities like volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis, right? You can actually develop an early detection system, right? Because we know that elephants are extremely good at it. We're trying to understand how they do it. In fact, there's a lot of studies explaining this phenomena. Um, the other reason why it is important to study this mechano vibrations and seismic communication is that, well, can we develop a particular technology to help deaf people or hearing impaired people hear better, or develop another alternative communication mechanism? Because what do you think the best medium that sound can travel? Through air, through water, or through solids? Through solids. The denser the medium, the better the sound signals travel, right? So if you can understand how elephants communicate, can we develop a particular device, a sensory device that can help hearing impaired people to communicate better, to understand the environment better? Well, so there are many benefits. In fact, I'm not exaggerating when I say that. One of the greatest elephant researchers, right, who studies elephant communication, is actually a professor in Stanford Medical School, right? Well, guess why? Guess why Stanford Medical School hired an ecologist, an animal biologist, right? um, to teach in a program that is tailored towards medical sciences. Well, I just explained you why. Dust bathing and mud bathing. There is an example of dust bathing over here, right? And mud bathing is simply doing the same with more water in the sediments. That is actually a very interesting phenomena, widely observed among both species of elephants. That actually is helpful to condition the skin. Mud bathing is actually much better than dust bathing. In fact, mud bathing is observed more among Asian elephants or in African elephants that have access to water, and dust bathing is observed among elephants that actually lives in more desert environments. Now, elephants do that in order to condition their skin. They use that strategy to get rid of parasites, because what you're doing is essentially smothering your skin, right, and preventing air breathing by the parasites like ticks and mites, whatnot, that is living on your skin. And actually it kind of creates an additional barrier on your skin, so prevents any kind of physical damage, right? It's kind of an important behavior that you observe among elephants. So these are actually some of the communications, very intimate communications, right, you observe among elephants. Like this one, putting the trunk sometimes on top of another elephant's head or sometimes inside its mouth, shows affection. Could happen between the same sexes or between two different sexes, largely observed within the same sex. In fact, I don't think it has any sexual signal. It's simply to show the group the affection towards each other within a particular herd, right? So in this case you can say it is tusker, so those are males showing that behavior, right? And another example over here, you can see, they're actually kind of, like doing a very cute head butting. Not butting, they're actually resting their trunks and heads with each other. I think another important thing I wanted to mention is, when does a male elephant leaves the matriarchal herd? Could happen anywhere between, as young as 10 years old, as old as 19 years old, right? So these guys lives very longer, so meaning there's a long juvenile period. So it's not surprising to see a 20-year-old, 19-year-old, 18-year-old young male still hanging out with his moms and sisters, right? It's kind of very interesting. And if there's a female elephant born to that particular herd, there's a greater chance she's sticking with the particular herd. Very low chance of her leaving that herd, because there's very unlikely to be recruited by another matriarchal herd unless she finds one that's closely related to her. So female babies stay in the herd, males leave, and don't stay longer than 20 years in their age. So that is actually musting, right? Like things leaks out of every body opening, right? This secretion, a viscous secretion that actually can be sensed by other elephants that shows that they are reproductively active. It signals for both receptive females as well as rival males. For receptive females, come and get me. Come and get me, right? I'm worthy of your effort, right? For other males, get the fuck out of my way, right? In this image, you actually see a newborn. You can see that the embryonic membranes are still around the baby, right? So, and you know, like first when it is born, right? When it's, mom poops it out, right? Or delivers it, not poops. When mom delivers it, it lands on the ground, and soon it is able to walk on its own feet, and then of course no sooner will it start suckling. And I did mention to you, suckling is not going to be limited to his own mom, right? It will drink milk. It will be fed by any other female in that particular group, right? Unlikely by his sisters, but most likely by the generation that her mom belongs to, right? But by his aunties. His sisters might tend him, right? Take care of him, protect him. And then play behavior, right? Now, play behavior is observed widely among many mammals, including carnivores, but it is extremely extravagant in elephants, right? And it actually, in other mammals, play behavior is limited to a very younger age, but the age of play behavior is much more extensive when it comes to elephants. And in fact, they do really cute and cuddly stuff. In this case, it seems like, like one of them, one of the young elephants is actually kind of, trying to push the other elephant like down some hole. And another thing is they will not let them die. They will actually pull it back, right? And in fact, if a baby elephant, particularly a juvenile, a young elephant gets into trouble, fell into some hole, and couldn't get himself out, the other members of the group, right, particularly the other females, will help, right? Like I mentioned earlier, there is a very strong degree of hierarchy. You can see in this one, the oldest female is way in the back, watching around, right? Another female is actually crossing, guarded by a couple of other females behind, right? And you can see 3 to 4 babies in between, right? And they actually are lining up. And again, this is actually also an interesting behavior. This is called salt licking. Elephants, they actually, access soil or grounds that actually are very rich in minerals, right? They actually kind of feed on them, right? And that's because, they actually require not only calories, but also minerals, to sustain their lives. And that is also kind of a vigilant behavior by a dominant female, where it kind of has a ears spread, trying to like kind of capture sound coming from around her. And you can see other larger females are doing exactly the same, following her, trying to be more vigilant. And this is also a group of them moving around, and you can see 2 of them, they have their trunks up. What they do is they're trying to sense the air, kind of smell the air, for danger or for threats, right? And elephants are extremely strong, right? They can actually, pull down trees. There are many examples, elephants trying to do it. We don't truly understand why they shake these trees, right? Of course, they can break off a branch and eat it as food, but like, why would they kind of, go out of their way to shake trees, fell them? We don't understand. Is it a sign of showing dominance? Is it something you only observing in musting males? No, not just limited to a few individuals, but it's something we don't truly understand. So I earlier showed you a particular map showing, the current distribution and the distribution that is suspected from the past. I'm showing a much more contrast over here on the left side, right? You can see that the African elephants, right, occupied a huge range. In fact, we suppose there's 2 subspecies. Some people might consider, some biologists might consider it's 2 species, but in literature, most often it is described as 2 subspecies. African forest elephant and African bush elephant, also known as African savanna elephant. And sometimes people even argue, scientists argue, there could be likelihood of at least three genetically distinct groups of elephants: the forest elephant, desert elephant, and the bush slash savanna elephants. But there are genetic evidences suggesting that at least three groups. Are they three subspecies? We don't know, right? But it is not a stretch to argue that there are three species of different genetically distinct populations. That would not be a stretch. That would be a reasonable argument. Um, their conservation status is considered vulnerable. The reason is, even up to today, their populations are large. There are sizable healthy populations. So because of that, throughout the African continent, their distribution is considered vulnerable. Given the threats, you might consider them critically endangered or endangered, but they are not anywhere closer to those levels. Thankfully, they are not. And partly the conservation efforts that we have actually ensures their conservation status does not get any worse. So you can see the forest elephant range is extremely small. Largely, it falls within the tropical African rainforests, the Congo Basin to a larger degree, and to a certain degree in the Western African forests. And the rest of the part is the bush elephant, are largely the savanna lands. That which actually partly includes part of the Saharan deserts, right, over here. And then the most healthier populations occurs in sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern Africa. In these environments, you actually have the savanna environment, right? And over here, you have largely the desert type environment, right? And then around here, you actually also have in the coast, right? You also have some of the desert elephant populations. Now, this map comes from, it's kind of getting old. It's coming from 2012, but that's actually when I have some information of good studies done. It's kind of about time for somebody to replicate a similar study. So by 2012, right, this is actually where African forest elephant and African bush slash savanna elephants occur, and we can see the forest elephant range compared to the historical range. They are shrinking a lot. In the Western Africa, it's limited to a very small fragmented pockets, right? Even within the Congo Basin, largely within Central African Republic, you can still see their populations are population ranges are shrinking. Their suitable habitats are shrinking. And yeah, largely the populations currently, occurs in many countries, Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, and in Rwanda, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Cameroon to a certain extent, right? That's actually the forested elephants. And then you have the bush elephants. Well, you do have them occurring in many different countries. Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Kenya, Tanzania, right, and Sudan. I'm extremely skeptic about the future of the Sudanese elephant populations, but in the Eastern Africa and in the Southern African countries I mentioned, I'm pretty confident that those populations are well protected. Still, there are threats going on, but it could have been worse. That's my point. Alrighty. So yeah, those are actually the two key subspecies that I wanted to mention. On the top, you are looking at the savanna elephants, also known as bush elephants, and on the bottom, you are looking at forest elephants, right? And yes, you may argue that some of the desert elephants as a genetically distinct population, right? It wouldn't be a stretch to say that, but definitely to subspecies level, just two, right? Forested elephant and the bush elephant slash savanna elephant. So the conservation problems can be summed up to a handful of these problems: corruption, poor law enforcement, poor governance, largely in the Central Africa, in the Congo Basin, right? There are lots of problems, right? The political corruption, the government-sponsored corruption is skyrocketing, and it's getting worse. The law enforcement, if it exists, is extremely poor. Most often, the governance of natural resources, habitats, forests doesn't exist, right? Or it is passive, it's just on the paper, right? The physical protection provided to elephants in the Central African realm, in the Congo Basin, is extremely poor, right? Still, they have the opportunity. There are habitats for protection, for effective conservation measures, but there's no interest in that particular part of the world. And in fact, absence of game guards, absence of game wardens, is actually a major problem. You need that kind of physical protection to protect an animal that is actively subjected to hunting. Now, if you move to the southern African part, the habitat loss and fragmentation is actually becoming a little bit more prominent even in the Eastern Africa, particularly in Kenya and Tanzania, with a lot of development going on, a lot of highway development going on. There's a threat to fragment those once extensive large grasslands, Serengeti Plain, for example. There are lots of developmental activities proposed that will bisect or fragment those landscapes that could create severe problems for elephants. In fact, even in the southern Africa, right, agriculture, animal husbandry, growth of human settlements, have severely fragmented once continuous landscapes. African elephants and Asian elephants both are known to roam wide, right? Their home ranges are extremely wide. It could be, hundreds of hectares, right? So the fragmentation, right, is actually severely impacting their movements, their habitat associations. They do navigate a lot seasonally, in search of best foraging grounds and in search of water. For all of to facilitate that kind of natural movements, they require continuity. So fragmentation is a major problem for them. And with the infrastructure development, like roads in particular, there are threats of them preventing from navigation, from preventing them accessing ideal optimal resources, right? And the human population density in Africa is increasing. In fact, at global scale, African continent is among the global regions where the human population increment is very high, right? In Asia, it's largely driven by China and India, but at global scale as a continent, Africa definitely tops most of the other nations or most of the other global regions. And hunting, right, particularly, well, why do people hunt elephants? For largely for the tusks, right? And in fact, because of that, the hunting based problem is much severe for African elephants, where you have a greater frequency of tuskers and a less of that problem in Asian elephants. In fact, we believe that Asian elephants also tend to have tuskers in a lower frequency, but the hunting has actually virtually eliminated the genetic infrastructure for creating large tusks. So today you actually have so many elephants, the Asian elephants, that do not grow tusks. So I cannot think of any. Are elephants hunt for meat? Unfortunately, no. Right? It's kind of a waste, because if you hunt something, use it. Right? That's kind of the principle of a hunter. If you kill something, use it. Right? Don't leave it to rot. But that's not the case of African elephants. They actually, if you kill it, when poachers kill it, it actually they cut off the tusks and let the rest of the carcass rot. Unbelievable. Fucking humans. The one of the worst species in the universe are humans, hands down. So in terms of threats, like why ivory has such a great why tusks have such a great demand is actually for these ivory based curios and ivory based decorations that they make. There's a huge range of these kind of decorations, things things that are for displays, for as ornaments, and in certain cases as a dagger holster. I have no idea why you need to make a dagger holster out of fucking ivory, but people do, right? Like I said, people are the worst. In fact, there are criminal syndicates in Africa, well, as well as in the rest of the world, to facilitate ivory trade, right? And in fact, and in certain countries, like in Sudan, there are government-aided militias, right, that actually fund operations that increases, that actually supports poaching of elephants. So it's really bad. It's actually the government that is supposed to protect these natural resources are the reason why elephants are declining, right? And in Somalia, there are terrorist groups, right, that actually support poaching, because that's actually is a source of an income for those terrorists. And in fact, in fact, in DRC, in Democratic Republic of Congo, in order, since the governments are so weak, right? Um, in order for the government to control terrorism coming from other parts of the world and for other neighboring countries, they actually provide weapons to local rebel groups, right? And who then takes those weapons um, to continue poaching activities, right? And in fact, the government itself will trade weapon for ivory. Like, it's kind of extremely a sad situation. And in fact, in this western parts, right, it comes with the forest destruction, forest exploitation, right? And that forest exploitation actually brings more worker immigrants to that particular area, which actually then goes, triggers more organized crimes that revolves around wildlife trafficking, right? And in Tanzania, there are allegations, serious allegations, that some government officials, right, have indirectly or kind of look the other way when ivory trade is happening, right? Uh, and in Zimbabwe, where there's a lot of political corruption, there are allegations that some of the political elites, politically powerful people, right, or people of power, right, like the Zimbabwean president, right, that sees or a space, as private game space where poaching will take place, right? In fact, in South Africa, right, there is a massive problem with where African crime syndicates, are battling against the army and the extremely well-trained forest rangers in terms of ivory trade and elephant poaching. I can go on with those problems, but I will stop. Now, is the problem endemic to Africa? No, I earlier mentioned the ivory trafficking is a global problem. Where do you think all the ivory collected from Africa ends up with? Well, of course, Africa is the source, largely the sub-Saharan and southern Africa is the source, but it ends up in Middle East, right, where you have rich, stupid people who have no idea what to do with their money, right, and then goes to Eastern Asia, and particularly ending up where? In China and other Eastern Asian countries, right? So the demand comes largely from Middle East and Eastern Asia, right? China in particular, Taiwan, Vietnam to a lesser degree. So in fact, this ivory over exploitation or poaching is not endemic to a single country in Africa, not endemic to a single nation. In Africa, of course, it's worse in some parts than others, but it's a global problem, right? So the solution should come as a global endeavor. In fact, some of the governments, what they do here is they actually stockpile ivory and then they burn them, right? And in fact, in certain cases, what they do is they stockpile ivory by sieges, by from custom enforcements. They actually collect in illegal ivory, or through by raiding with forest rangers or law enforcement, or by the army. They actually seize this illegal ivory, they stockpile them, and sometimes what they do is, in order to reduce the demand, they send those back to the market, right? Well, that doesn't actually solve the problem permanently, and in certain cases they actually seize them and destroy them, right? Because like it's even dangerous to have a stockpile. And you can see in this particular map, like how much, like in the recent years, right, the ivory stockpiles have grown, right? And then you can also see the couple of red dots that shows, where the governments actually sold the ivories. The idea is actually to reduce the demand, right? If you sell them to a much cheaper price, the demand goes down, right? If the demand goes down, the price you earn through hunting them goes also down. So that's kind of the idea behind the stockpile sales. There are some criticism regarding that, and also there's criticism regarding destroying ivory stockpiles. But anyways, we can see that actually in the recent years, the stockpile weights have actually substantially increased, right? And there's a trend that it suggests it might go down in future. The seasons are actually kind of going down. Stockpiles are increasing because it accumulates over the years, right? But the number of seasons happening is actually going down, which is a good thing. I don't know whether it's actually there are now fewer individuals doing it, but those fewer individuals are actually trading massive amounts of ivory. That's a bad thing, but at least in terms of regulation and law enforcement, if you have only fewer criminals doing that, it's easy to police them. Um, Encroachment is also a major problem, right? In African continent, right, southern sub-Saharan Africa, Central Africa, even in Northern Africa, agriculture and cattle ranching is a major livelihood, right? So the problem with and you can see in the top image that actually it's kind of a open wetland, grassland, ranging area that's actually intended for common use. Some farmers are actually doing cattle ranching, and back in the background you can see several African elephants, right? So this shows that there's a very very tight interface between the humans and the wildlife, right? Which is quite um, problematic in terms of conservation, in terms of wildlife management, right? So in crop fields, what you have is monocrop plantations, right? In one image you can see sugarcane on the in the and then no matter what, well, sugarcane is actually something I want to mention specifically about sugarcane, is that sugarcane is a preferred diet of elephants, right? Why? High in calories, it tastes really well, right? Edible, right? Perfectly fit with the elephant diet, right? So any crop that you grow, it's actually high in caloric values, because when you're farming, you genetically select, right, for certain traits that is actually high yield, right? High caloric value, high nutrient value, right? So elephants are naturally attracted to those. I told you that elephants can sense very well. They know where to find good food. And these crop farms that are right next to the wilderness is a good place to feed. They don't know any better, and in fact those grounds used to belong to them. It's the stupid people who actually encroached the forest and farmed, right? So I don't know, maybe like this should happen to them, right? So elephants will keep actually raiding. For me as a conservation biologist, I don't give a fuck about the farmers, like screw the fuckers. But the problem is when elephants keep raiding farmlands, right? Those fucking stupid farmers start killing elephants by shooting them or poisoning them, right? So and sometimes what they do is they started putting poison baits, right? Or setting up traps around their farm field, sometimes in the forest, right? That actually creates massive problems. On the top image, it's actually coming from one of the research articles I read. It's actually the red color shows the fence. So the idea here is, when there is a large enough protected area, historically, the conservation authorities placed a fence around that protected area. So, and then the fence is also electrified, so elephants do not cross it, right? Electric shock is not that bad. It actually kind of creates a tingling sensation, so an elephant who gets electroshocked once will not try to cross it, right? That's kind of at least the idea, right? And the blue dots represents water bodies, and the lines in different colors, different shades of reds to greens, show elephant movements. Green lines show elephant movements during monsoon season, red lines show elephant movements during dry season. And this study comes from a northern Namibian national park, right? And the tracks comes from actually monitoring done by radio collar by following radio collared, radio tagged elephants, 6 of them shown over here. So you can clearly see that there are actually the movement patterns are conservative, right? And there are areas where they concentrate during dry seasons, particularly in areas where there are profitable feeding grounds or there's water, right? And in fact, you can also see, like up towards the top, there are lots of efforts, elephants, in concentrating at the border, right, at the fence. The same thing down towards the south, right? So there seems like that particular border is not very effective. It does not cover enough grounds for elephants. There is some evidence that elephants are trying to roam at a wider range. In fact, so I did mention farmlands and ranchlands are heavily encroached by elephants, particularly in ranchlands, especially if it's a private ranchland. Farmers actually also introduce more nutritionally rich edible grasses, which are also preferred by elephants, right? And during crop raiding, the problem is actually elephants are known to walk in if there's a building across the pathway they don't go around the building, they actually break the building and go through it, right? That's kind of what elephants do, right? Probably the reason why they might actually like those knock off trees and things like that, some sort of a behavior they have. So you cannot blame them when stupid people put a farmland and a house in the middle of an elephant's pathway that rightfully belongs to the elephant, not to the fucking people, right? You cannot blame the elephant for doing that. It's natural animal behavior. And I did mention farmed crops are high in nutritional value, high in caloric value, right? And during drier seasons, this problem is much severe because of irrigation. Farmlands are active even during the dry season. So the scarcity food is high in the protected area, in the forest. So the elephants actually naturally, tend to wander away looking for better food sources. An elephant home range is quite conservative, which is actually easy to protect, right? Because if you know, like by studies, you can understand what their home ranges are. By radio collars, you can understand their home range. And using that, you can actually redesign protected areas to effectively protect the entire roaming range of an elephant in both dry season and wet season. The attacks of human were reportedly very high, but it's not like the elephants are actively going after humans, although they should, right? But no, there is no motive or a biologically reasonable, biologically justifiable reason for an elephant to vengefully attack humans. It doesn't happen. It could be accidental. It's because of provocation. It could be, but attack on humans is, if there are some, it's accidental, right? But and the problem of this human wildlife conflict, human animal conflict, is actually, ultimately, regrettably, animals are going to lose. Elephants are going to lose. There's evidence of shooting, baiting, trapping, right? And the deaths are horrible. You cannot kill an elephant with a single gunshot, right? It's and poisoning is actually like unbelievable, right? So this kind of, like the closer the interface between human settlement and the wild lands, the worse the conflict is going to be.